So the other day, I was walking through the snow, and I was daydreaming about summer. About the heat, and about no school, because finals are awful, and just making plans about traveling, and just different things like that. And I started reminiscing about, a few years ago, I got a summer job at a kids camp, and it was awesome. And I was so excited. And it was my first job like this, and I didn't really know what to expect, and I came in late in the summer, and I missed training. But I was confident, and I was like, I got this. So I went in, and my first week of camp, I had this girl named Emma. And my group was in the gym with a few other groups, and they're all running around and playing. And Emma was talking with my counselor in training. And she was just talking with her, I couldn't really hear her, and all of a sudden she took off running. And I was like, okay, we're in a gym, everyone's running and playing, whatever. And another counselor in the gym yelled, "You got a runner!" And I was like, what? And I just looked at her and was like, are you talking to me? And she said, just like stares at me, waiting for me to do something. And I was like, I don't know what I'm supposed to do. And so I just stared back at her. And she yelled, "You have to go catch!" And then just threw down her clipboard and took off running. And I was like, what is happening? But I figured if she was running, then I should probably run too. So I ran after her. So Emma's running, the counselor's running, and I'm chasing both of them. Still not really sure what's happening. I just thought Emma was going to the bathroom. I didn't know. So we're running, and we run outside, and the counselor yells, "Emma!" And so I yelled, "Emma!" And then she's like, "Where are you?" And so I said, "Where are you?" And then I was like, oh, I understand what's happening. I have to find this girl now. She could be anywhere, and it's totally going to fall on me. And then I got really nervous. And I stopped, and I remembered earlier in the week she told me her favorite place on camp, and like, it was so great. So I went there, and sure enough, there she was. Turns out, Emma was upset because she was talking with my other counselor, and she didn't feel like she was being listened to. She didn't feel like the counselor was paying enough attention to her, and she just thought, if I just run away, no one will notice, everything will be fine, and I don't have to deal with this anymore. So she ran off. So I want to talk about another runner today, because that's the name that we give kids like Emma, apparently. It's runners. Another runner is in Genesis 16. So if you like, you can open to Genesis 16. It says this: Now Sarah, Abraham's wife, had borne him no children, but she had an Egyptian slave named Hagar. So she said to Abram, "The Lord kept me from having children. Go sleep with my slave. Perhaps I can build a family through her." Abram agreed to what Sarah said. So after Abram had been living in Canaan 10 years, Sarah, his wife, took her Egyptian slave Hagar and gave her to her husband to be his wife. He slept with Hagar, and she conceived. When she knew she was pregnant, she began to despise her mistress. Then Sarai said to Abram, "You are responsible for the wrong I am suffering. I put my slave in your arms, and now that she knows she's pregnant, she despises me. May the Lord judge between you and me." "Your slave is in your hands," Abram said. "Do with her whatever you think best." Then Sarai mistreated Hagar, so she fled from her. The angel of the Lord found Hagar near a spring in the desert. It was the spring that is beside the road to Shur, and he said, "Hagar, slave of Sarai, where have you come from, and where are you going?" "I'm running away from my mistress, Sarai," she answered. Then the angel of the Lord told her, "Go back to your mistress and submit to her." The angel added, "I will increase your descendants so much that they will be too numerous to count." The angel of the Lord also said to her, "You are now pregnant, and you will give birth to a son. You shall name him Ishmael, for the Lord has heard your misery. He will be a wild donkey of a man, his hand will be against everyone, and everyone's hand against him. And he will live in hostility toward all his brothers." She gave this name to the Lord who spoke to her. "You are the God who sees me." For she said, "I have now seen the one who sees me." And when I read this passage, my heart really goes out to Hagar. And I think about what it would be like to be in Hagar's shoes. And I don't think that's originally what people think when they read this, but Hagar is just an Egyptian slave working for her mistress, and all of a sudden she comes in and says, "Here, go have sex with my husband, conceive." And then when she does, she gets pregnant, she's horribly mistreated by the one who sent her to him. Seems a little messed up. And I'm sure Hagar is not blameless here. She got an attitude with Sarai, which is what actually caused this mistreatment. But when you think about it, these are people of the Lord. People are supposed to treat her well, and instead she mistreats her and causes her to run off. And you have to think it must be pretty bad for a pregnant lady to run off into the desert alone, leaving behind her life and her God. And she was approached in the desert by an angel of the Lord, and she was on her way to Egypt to return to her old gods. The Lord came to address her, and he said, Hagar, slave of Sarai. He didn't say Hagar, wife of Abram, but slave of Sarai. Because that's who she was. That's the role in which God had placed her, that she was running away from. The angel of the Lord asked her, where have you come from and where are you going? And of course he knows the answer to this. He's God, he knows. But he asked her to say, do you really know what you're doing? Because if you think about this, you're leaving this highly favored household to run to an uncertain future without me. And she admits to running, and he gives her 2 commands. Go back and submit to your mistress. Humble yourself, submit to her authority, and to however she treats you. And this tells us that Hagar was in the wrong. Not only did she despise her mistress and not submit to her authority, she endangered the child by leaving and going on this reckless journey just because she had hurt feelings. Because it seemed easier to run away than to stick through the hard times. And running usually does look easier. For Hagar, she was alone and distraught and hurt because of the household she was living in. And going back to Egypt looked so much easier. A few years ago, I lived in Nicaragua for 1.5 years, and I was doing missions work with some other missionaries. And my first 6 months there, I went to this tiny little church out in the middle of nowhere with 2 of my friends. And to get to this church, we had to take a bus with like 200 other people crammed in, sweaty and smelly. And they tried to pickpocket you and hold your hand and all kinds of stuff. So we take this bus and get off, take a little rickshaw motorbike into the woods a few miles, get off, walk a mile, cross some rivers, and then finally we were at the church. Once we got to the church, there would be no one there. And we'd spend all weekend here to serve because we were asked to by the National Church. Go here and serve and live with the family. So that's what we did. And we would show up and there would be no one there. And we would sit outside in the sun for hours and hours before anyone would show up. And finally the pastor or his family would show up and we'd try and talk with them and hang out with them, and they wanted nothing to do with us. They never talked with us. They never gave us any ministry to do. Well, rarely. They usually didn't feed us the whole weekend. Like, they just didn't want us there. And it was obvious. And it was really hard for me to take. Here I was, 18 years old, fresh out of high school. I jumped into missions, ready to change the world. And I was met with culture shock, dealing with rats and bugs in my bed, and just like all this crazy stuff. Pickpocketers, and then resentment from the people I was just trying to serve and help. And that was really hard for me to handle. And when we would leave every weekend for the church, we would go sit outside and wait for the bus for a few hours. And as we sat there, I would say, guys, would anyone really notice if we didn't go? I mean, the pastor's not going to care. Missionaries will never find out. We can just stay in our rooms all weekend and hide and not go, please. And we'd laugh about it, and then we'd get on the bus, all wishing that we actually could do that. And then we'd get on the bus and go, and we'd hit this fork in the road, where if you go right, it takes us to our next stop where we get off and go to our church. But if you go left, it takes you to the beach. But every time we hit this fork in the road, we would talk about what it would be like if we went to the beach instead and just ran away from our troubles, and because it was so hard. I mean, it was hard, but in reality, if I look back on it, I mean, I was probably just being a wuss. But I just wanted to go to the beach and run away from it all, and we would talk about it and how great it would be and how easy it would be and how mad it would make our leaders when they found out, which seemed pretty good at the moment. But we never went. We stuck it out, and we stayed there for 6 months every weekend. And by the end of the 6 months, the church was tiny, with 10 people, slowly started to open up to us. We finally made this little connection in our last 3 weeks there. And those connections that we made at the very end of our time there turned into opportunities of ministry in the future, and later on seeing a lot of testimonies come from it and some really awesome things. And it was totally worth it. Now. But back then I didn't see that. I couldn't see anything but this hardship over here and the beach over here where I wanted to be. But God had a plan to use the hardship and to use my time there. And he had a plan to use it for something good that I just couldn't see yet. And he said, if you just stick it out, then you'll see the good. And that's how it seemed for Hagar. She just thought it would be easier to run, just like I did. And the name Hagar actually means runaway, which she did twice. We read about one. But first she ran from Egypt and ended up at Abram's camp. And then she ran from Abram's camp to go back to Egypt. And in my opinion, I never really thought about Hagar being that important reading through this story. Just thought, so she ran away, big deal. God's going to give Abram and Sarah their kid anyway, so what does she matter? Just let her run. And I think that's kind of the same thing that she thought. If I just run, this is going to be over and it's done. But God saw her and had a plan that included this Egyptian slave girl. But it was not an easy plan. It was not easy for her, but it proved to be worth it when the angel of the Lord came to her and said, look, this is what I'm going to give you. I'm going to give you descendants. I'm going to give you a son. And this is what your son's going to be like. If you just stick with me, these are the things that are going to happen. If you just stick it out through the hard times, you'll see that it's going to be worth it. God met her in the desert, which was at her worst, when she not only just thought about quitting giving up, but she actually did and just ran off. God came running after her like I had to run after my girl at camp, even though I didn't know what was happening at first. And God met her where she was, turned her around, and just told her, stick with it. He heard her misery, and he saw her. When we go through something difficult, it's easier for us to go and find the way out rather than toughing it out. But God says to go back and to submit, to not run from hardship, because hardship is when we realize that we really need God the most. When we really trust in God and find peace that he has the plan, and that although he has the plan, some of those plans include hardship. For Hagar, it included going back, humbling herself before Sarah, and submitting to this mistreatment, because that was the plan, and it ended up being worth it. And for me, it seemed like it would never end, and it seemed like it was so hard and difficult, and I couldn't deal with it, and really it just ended up being so worth it, and I would do it again in a heartbeat. And I think Hagar would say the same thing. So be encouraged by Hagar's story, that God sees you in the desert, and that the hard times prove to be worth it. James 1:12 says this, blessed are those who persevere under trial, because when they have stood the test, they will receive the crown of life that God has promised to those who love him.